George Soros spoke before the Council of Foreign Relations in Chicago on his new book, Open Society, Reforming Global Capitalism. In it, he examines the current global economic system and outlines its problems. It's about an hour.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I could have your attention, please. I'm John Riley, President of the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening to this lecture by George Soros. I want to extend a special welcome to members of the Consular Corps who are here this evening, and also a special welcome to our students from Lake Forest College who are studying the whole subject of globalization, a subject on which our speaker tonight is one of the world's leading experts. One of the keys to the success of the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations over the past 78 years is the active participation of its board of directors. We're very fortunate to have on our board many of the top leaders of Chicago, and one of those, Fred Steingraber, who is the chief executive officer of A.T. Kearney, a large diversified management consultant firm that has enjoyed spectacular growth over the last decade, is with us here this evening. Fred Steingraber serves as the director of the Development Committee of the Council's board, as well as a member of the Council's European Advisory Board. It's a great pleasure to introduce Fred Steingraber to this Council audience, who will introduce our featured speaker. Fred Steingraber.
Thank you very much, John. It's a pleasure indeed to be here and join you this evening for this very special occasion. It's perhaps commonplace to point out that extraordinary men are created out of extraordinary circumstances, and certainly our speaker this evening is no exception. George Soros has had a remarkable career as an international financier and philanthropist. The first individual to earn more than $1 billion in a single year, Soros is recognized the world over as one of the savviest of international investors. But perhaps he's achieved even greater fame through his philanthropic work and his very acute geopolitical analysis. Starting in 1979, when he established the Open Society Fund, and continuing through the end of the Cold War and on into the post-communist era, George Soros has been one of the chief advocates and supporters of human liberty around the globe. Soros credits his commitment to civil society to his first-hand experience of its alternative as a young man, first during the Nazi persecution in occupied Hungary, and later the communist oppression that soon followed. He was one of the earliest supporters of the Charter 77 movement in Czechoslovakia and of Solidarity in Poland. And together with a handful of other distinguished human beings, such as Pope John Paul II, Lech Walesa, Václav Havel, and Nelson Mandela, stands clearly as one of our age's great contributors to human freedom. Building on his success with the Open Society Fund, Soros now funds a network of foundations that operate in more than 30 countries throughout Central and Eastern Europe and Central Eurasia, as well as in Southern Africa, Haiti, Guatemala, and the United States. And together, these foundations annually provide more than $500 million to advance the establishment of open, democratic societies. His most recent book, The Crisis of Global Capitalism, Open Society Endangered, was published in 1998 and has generated a great deal of controversy. In it, Mr. Soros asserts that just as fascism and communism once threatened open societies by virtue of their claim to the ultimate truth, laissez-faire capitalism may pose a dissimilar yet still potent threat through its dogmatic faith in the efficiency of the free market. In 1963, Martin Luther King had the following to say: "Philanthropy is commendable, but it must not cause the philanthropist to overlook the circumstances of economic injustice which make philanthropy necessary." Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in introducing to you one philanthropist who has taken those words truly to heart, George Soros.
Thank you very much. I think this is, I'm slightly overwhelmed by the turnout, frankly. And I'm not even quite sure what I should say. I'm actually here to promote my next book, which is a follow-up on the crisis of global capitalism, which is Open Society, Reforming Global Capitalism. And I can't possibly tell you what's in the book, because if I could, then I wouldn't have had to write a book about it. So I think I'd just like to focus on a couple of topics on U.S. foreign policy, globalization, and the international financial architecture, the need to reform and how to reform the international financial institutions. But first, I'd like to just mention one basic idea which underlies all the arguments in the book, which is really a very simple idea, that there's always a gap between our understanding and the reality in which we live. Sometimes the gap is larger and at other times smaller, and there is a two-way interaction between our thinking and the world in which we live, where we try to understand the world, but we are also changing it. And that is why we can't have perfect understanding, because what our thinking relates to is influenced by our thinking and our actions. To get a true statement, you need the facts on the one side and the statement on the other, and if the statement corresponds to the facts, then it's true. If it doesn't, then it's false, and of course that's the basis of science. But when it comes to human affairs, this separation actually doesn't exist. Now, I developed this idea in many different ways. In itself, there's nothing new about the idea, but I would like to now focus on this gap which exists in our US foreign policy. First of all, there's a tremendous gap the way we see ourselves and our role in the world, and how the rest of the world often perceives us. We feel that we are, the righteous ones, and very often people in other parts of the world see the arrogance of power. So there is quite a big gap there, and there's also a considerable gap between what we say and what we do. I think a very good example is a recent, actually an article by Sam Berger in the current issue of Foreign Affairs, where he outlines the accomplishments of the Clinton administration, and that's based on a speech he gave at the New York Council on Foreign Affairs. And he really outlined all the things that I think the United States ought to stand for. So at the end of the meeting, I went up to him and I said, you've said it better than I could have said it. I mean, I underwrite and every word you've said. And then he kind of told me a joke about Adlai Stevenson, where he said, the trouble is that I don't believe every word I said. And in fact, that is I mean, you see, the United States is the sole surviving superpower and the leader of the free world. Now, these two, being a superpower and being a leader of the free world, were really synonymous during the Cold War. But when the Cold War ended, we faced a choice. Which of those two factors was more important? Now, I don't think it's a choice in the sense that we can possibly abdicate our military power. Because obviously there are times when we need to be able to call on it. But to be the leader of the free world requires more than just being a military power. It's too late if it comes to military intervention. There is a lot that could be done actually just simply to make the world a better place, where you would have fewer conflicts, fewer crises. And when it comes to that kind of leadership, I'm afraid the United States has been lagging. There are some people are quite scathing about U.S. foreign policy in my book, and some people have told me that maybe I'm overdoing it because people don't like to be upbraided. But I think that we have and we are continuing to lose an opportunity, because we are the dominant power in the world today, both militarily and economically. So it is really up to us to shape the system in which we live, to shape the world order. Now, when we look at the world order, we are now in a rather new situation. It's not only that the Soviet Union has collapsed and we have emerged as a sole superpower, but also we now have a global economy, a truly global economy. And that is also a rather new development. I mean, globalization means many different things, but to me it means basically global markets and the free movement of capital from one place to one country to another. And that, if you think of it, is a relatively recent development. It started in the 70s, because when at the end of the Second World War, when the Bretton Woods institutions were established, you basically had no private capital movements. And the Bretton Woods institutions were established to make international trade possible in the absence of capital movements. But then in the 70s, with the oil crisis and the oil surpluses in the oil-producing countries and the deficits in the oil-consuming countries, you then had tremendous capital transfers through the banks. And that's when you had the creation of the euro-dollar markets, various offshore markets. That's when capital really began to move more freely. And then around 1980, when President Reagan came to power in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in England, you then had a concerted effort to remove the obstacles to capital movement, and that's really when let's say the global capitalist system as it currently exists took off. And then, of course, came the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that made it truly global. Now, when you look at the system, it is actually quite crisis-prone, because you had a international debt crisis in 1982, which really led to a lost decade for Latin America. Then, for the moment, we don't need to talk about 1987. That was just a small tremor. But in 90, you had the Mexican crisis in '94, and then you had the global financial crisis in '97, which lasted really till January 99, when finally Brazil reached a climax and started getting out of its problems. So it's a 2-year. Now, also the markets have shown remarkable resilience. In other words, they have come back from those crises. But there's also a very interesting feature that the crises have affected the periphery of the global capitalist system. When they threatened the center, then appropriate action was taken to prevent it from leading to any kind of a financial collapse. When the default of Russia really and the long-term capital crisis sort of shook the system or threatened to shake the system, first of all, steps were taken to prevent the collapse of long-term capital management, and interest rates were lowered so as to make sure that the economy recovers. So there is a big difference between being at the center and being at the periphery, because at the periphery you might get the IMF to bail you out, but you are left with the burden of the debt to work off to the best of your capacity. And when the crisis strikes, the objective of the IMF is to preserve the system and to prevent a default. So it lends money to allow the countries to meet their obligations, but the obligations then, of course, weigh on the country concerned. The first step is to raise interest rates to prevent the flight of capital, whereas, for instance, in '98, the first step what the Federal Reserve did was to lower interest rates in order to help economic recovery. So there is a real difference. It is genuinely an uneven playing field, this global capitalist system that we have. We are not really prepared to admit this. We believe that markets tend towards equilibrium, and if you abide by the market discipline, then let the best succeed. But there is a difference being in charge of the system or being dependent on somebody else. Now, there's of course great differences in wealth, but this difference between being in charge and not being in charge is present even if there are no differences in wealth. I would draw your attention to the European exchange rate mechanism, which depended on the Bundesbank. The Bundesbank was in charge. The other countries were not really any poorer than Germany. But when German reunification came and it created inflationary pressures in Germany, the Bundesbank's first role was to raise interest rates to counteract inflation in Germany, whereas, let's say, England, Italy, and other members of the exchange rate system would have needed lower interest rates. So the action of the Bundesbank set up pressures which eventually led to the breakdown of the system, which actually led to a rather attractive business opportunity for me as a fund manager. But so the point I'm making is that being in charge, being at the center, you have an advantage, and I think you have also an obligation to make the system work for the benefit of all its members. Because if you have a system where people don't benefit, it's basically not sustainable. It's also not very attractive, morally or ethically. Now, let me now focus particularly on the international financial system and the consequences of the last crisis. The reaction has been to look for a reform, to take steps that the last crisis would not recur. And in fact, our global financial system has changed quite radically, even though it is not recognized. It's not generally seen. But we've gone from a system of bailing out to a system of bailing in, which is a 180-degree turn. The current catchword is that we have to eliminate the moral hazard that goes with bailing out debtor countries. And so elimination of moral hazard, that is the catchword. Burden sharing, the private sector has to share the burden of any financial reorganization. Now, this actually is a major step forward. I think it is a good thing to eliminate this bailing out, which left, for instance, the taxpayers of Mexico to pay for the rescue and the collapse of the Mexican banking system. So it is actually a positive reform, but it isn't enough, because if now the private sector has to recognize the very real risks involved in investing in less developed economies, they want to charge for it, because the private sector is not a philanthropic institution. So if they will charge according to the risk that they are taking. And since there are now very severe risks, they are now charging very hefty premiums. And the steps that have been taken together also with other steps for, increased transparency, establishing various standards in banking, all those are very good things. But they will, I think, avoid a recurrence of the last crisis. But the next problem that I see emerging is an inadequate flow of capital to the less developed countries. And I think this is something that's already observable. You see the spreads, the premiums that sovereign debt from emerging countries has to pay. You see actually you see a continuing a trade deficit and current account deficit in the United States, which is financed by attracting the savings from the rest of the world. Because now capital is free to move, it is being sucked up into the center, but is not being pushed out to the periphery sufficiently. So we now have a rather anomalous situation that the United States is running a chronic deficit on its current account, which is financed by the savings attracted from the rest of the world. And you also see it in the behavior of the financial markets of the periphery, which have turned down before our markets have turned down. So, in my opinion, we are now in a weaker situation to withstand a new storm of any kind. And the previous crisis occurred without any trouble at the center. Should there be a hard landing in the United States, then I think the international system is going to be rather severely tested. Now, I have some views about what we ought to do to reform it. I don't know how we stand on time. Yeah? Okay. Okay, that's very broadly. I mean, I think that there are four major requirements. One is free access to markets. And that is basically the job of the World Trade Organization. And it does a pretty good job. And I think that the United States has also taken steps in giving access to African countries, Caribbean countries. So I think as far as access to markets, we are in a let's say in a positive mode. Now there's a lot of resentment of the World Trade Organization. As we're all familiar with the Seattle riots and the alliance of civil society organizations and trade unions, etc., attacking the World Trade Organization. I think this is most unfortunate. It's a very, I find it disturbing that there should be two forces opposed to international financial institutions. One is the conservative majority in Congress, and the other is civil society. They make strange bedfellows, and I think it's a very unfortunate coalition, and I'd very much like to build a different kind of coalition, which would be devoted to strengthening, reforming and strengthening our international financial institutions rather than destroying them. Now, that is where I think, for instance, the World Bank could come in as an institution who considers its mission the alleviation of poverty and a provision of global public goods. But the way the World Bank is structured, it is an intergovernmental organization. It is ruled by a board of directors that represent states, and very often the directors are more interested in fostering, let's say, a project that is good for the export industry of the country concerned, rather than the benefit of the recipient country. That is only natural. And but even worse, most of the loans have to go through the recipient governments, and very often the governments then use the loans they get to strengthen their position, and often they are repressive governments, which benefit from having the World Bank supply them with capital. So I think that what the World Bank does is fine, and it would be, again, a pity to interfere with it. But because actually, you know, with the way it is structured, it's one of the most brilliant pieces of financial engineering, because you have some guarantees which are never called on, which nevertheless give the World Bank the ability to borrow at very good rates in the market and lend. So in itself it's a positive force. But in order to provide these global public goods, and by that I mean, let's say, fighting infectious diseases, AIDS, drug-resistant tuberculosis, and so on, protecting the rainforests, universal primary education. Lending, the way the World Bank does, is really not appropriate. I mean, I'd been involved I got involved unwittingly in multi-drug resistant tuberculosis in Russia, which is where it's in prisons, and particularly strongly entrenched there. And now the World Bank is giving a loan to Russia to let's say, build on the project that I started. But you need a loan also to Kazakhstan, and in any case, to give loans in fighting, let's say, tuberculosis or AIDS, how is that country going to repay it? It doesn't actually create wealth that could service. So it really should not be in the form of loans, but it should be in the form of grants. And the World Bank has developed a mechanism called trust funds. The only problem is that nobody contributes significant amounts to it. But the mechanism is there. And it should be used more fully. I wanted to talk about the role of the IMF as a lender of last resort, but I think that my time is up. Let me just say this, that the analogy with the central bank in a country is somewhat misleading, because the central bank actually has control over the banking system to which it is willing to act as a lender of last resort. The IMF is not. So it cannot be an unlimited source of funding to financial systems that get into difficulties. Nevertheless, there ought to be a differentiation in the amounts that are available, greater differentiation than there is at the present time. And there ought to be some mechanism for providing positive incentives to invest in less developed countries. Some form of a guarantee mechanism for those countries that are following approved or good economic policies, that the people who lend to them would be assured that they would not be bailed in if trouble comes, that the IMF would be ready to lend and make the private lenders good, but not give the same assurance for other countries that don't meet the standards. I've got more to say, but I think I'll stop at this point.
Well, thank you very much, George Soros, for a stimulating introduction to this broad subject. As you know, it's our custom here at these large meetings of the Chicago Council to take your questions on cards. Cards have been distributed, and members of the staff will now collect them. Let me begin our discussion by asking you a question about globalization. As you know, many experts in writing about globalization, have emphasized the decline in importance of the nation state. And yet Joel Klein and the U.S. Justice Department have recently reminded us that even the most powerful institutions and the most powerful individuals are subject to national norms which are enforced by national governments. My question, has the decline of the nation state been exaggerated, or is it truly likely to become an endangered species? Why don't we start with that?
Good.
Yeah, right there. Yeah.
Well, the system remains based on the sovereignty of the states, and one of the things that actually is wrong with the present arrangements is that our international institutions are also associations of states. And as you know, states have interests but not principles, and so principles often get lost. So sovereignty of the states remains, but the ability of the state to tax and regulate capital has largely disappeared, because capital can move elsewhere, and it can, if it's not well treated, it will go somewhere else. So the financial resources of the state have been undermined. As countries in Europe that stick to the old welfare state are discovering to their own discomfort.
Brett.
Question here about Russia. Russia continues to face one economic crisis after another. Should the U.S. government take on a more proactive role in assisting Russia in this regard, and if so, how?
I think, first of all, Russia is doing quite well, surprisingly well economically, mainly because of the high price of oil and the fact that they've defaulted on their debt. So then, at the moment, actually, economically, they are doing well. I was, of course, an avid advocate of a more proactive role in helping Russia to make the transition from a closed to an open society. But I think the historic moment has passed. I think now a new system has emerged, which was, I called it rubber capitalism. It is now slowly making the transition to more legitimate capitalism. But and if they do, then there will be perhaps room for private investment, in other words, for-profit investment. The time to bring about systemic transformation the opportunity was missed.
A number of questions related to what you said about the United States being regarded as arrogant. Can the United States avoid being accused of arrogance if it continues to push its policy of humanitarian interventions?
That, of course, is a very interesting question. And I'll talk about the NATO bombing as our way of intervening in Kosovo. Because I was very much in favor of taking a hard line with Milosevic. And so I feel a kind of a personal sense of responsibility, even though it wasn't me who did it. I wasn't asked about it. But I feel it very personally. And I feel that we have got to make good on our intervention in order to justify it. In other words, it was the right thing to do, provided we follow through and create a better social and economic environment in the Balkans. Now, this is a job for Europe more than for the United States, because the European Union can bring the countries in the region closer together by bringing them closer to the European Union. And this idea has tremendous appeal. So I am advocating a customs union in the Balkans, which has a sort of an asymmetric benefit of access to the European Union. And I think it's an idea that would change the entire atmosphere in the region, and I think then the intervention will have been justified. But if we only bomb from high altitude, where we make sure that we don't have any of our soldiers or they are at minimum risk, I think that this accusation of arrogance of power would be justified.
Here's an easy question. How can the euro survive?
I think it is actually quite a reasonably easy answer, because the European Central Bank has to intervene to support it. Unfortunately, they are afraid of the power of the markets, and they're afraid of their own shadow. If they were a little bit more forceful, they could certainly stabilize the euro.
Another question related to the IMF. Will the IMF remain suspect in many parts of the world as long as it is perceived as an arm of the U.S. Treasury?
Yes, because it is an arm of the U.S. Treasury with you know, some assist from the other countries, Europe and European countries and Japan, but it is the center that controls the IMF, and that is why it behooves the center to take care of the interests of the periphery, and if it does, then I think it will gain more respect and more support.
How do you perceive the new government of Mexico and the stability of the Mexican peso?
I'm not qualified to say anything on the Mexican peso, and I think that the political development is very promising.
As pointed out, the United States has one of the lowest savings rates in the world and continues to be reliant on foreign capital. Meanwhile, it runs massive current account trade deficits. How long can this be sustained without leading to disaster?
Actually, I think it can be sustained quite long. There is a fear that if you have an economic slowdown here, that the capital would leave. I think that in a bear market, I can't imagine, let's say, Indian capitalists taking their money back to India as a way of protecting themselves. So actually, I think that the dollar is likely to remain strong, and this situation can be sustained longer than one would expect.
A timely question. Does uncertainty in the U.S. presidential election pose any threat to the U.S. dollar or U.S. equities? And how long before the world begins to lose confidence in U.S. assets?
I mean, I think that it certainly has affected the equity market, and it hasn't affected the dollar. And I think it's a very temporary phenomenon, which will be resolved. So I wouldn't like to, you know, one thing you learn is never to make short-term predictions.
Other questions related to a future U.S. government. What single action could the new United States government take to ensure the prolongation of the economic boom of the last decade?
I think that the armory is quite full. I do expect a reasonably hard landing, but I think that you've got a big fiscal surplus, so there is room for fiscal stimulation, and you've had a fairly tight monetary policy, so there is room for monetary easing. I think that the Fed is unlikely to try to anticipate the slowdown or slower growth, and that's why I expect a bit of a rough landing. But I think once it is clear that there is a slowdown, there's plenty of weapons that can be employed. So I think that I can't see it I don't think it's going to get out of hand.
Is international debt relief a good idea, or will it lead to renewed financial irresponsibility on the part of third world countries?
Well, I think the debt relief for the highly indebted countries is an excellent idea because they are really suffocating from it, and in any case, they have no access to new lending, so they don't lose anything if they get relief, and I think more needs to be done, and more resources have to be made available, not just to give debt relief, but to encourage economic growth. In a country like, let's say, Mozambique, which actually has a decent government, at least at the top, because I don't want to comment on the bureaucracy. I think there ought to be more financing available for them to get a growth dynamic. Or South Africa, which has a government that is, let's say, very responsible in financial matters and is losing some political support because of the lack of growth. So there has to be, and that actually was one of the elements I wanted to mention in my talk about the architecture, that there has to be some structural financing available to get economic growth going, but it should be recognized that it's a risky business which may or may not work, and therefore it has to be done in a way that you would be willing to write it off if it fails. I think that the IMF started to get into trouble when it was given the job of helping Russia and the other communist countries, because the IMF is not really suited to provide the kind of support that Russia needed at the time. So there has to be a new method, a new mechanism for structural loans, different from what we have at the present time.
A number of questions related to Europe. It's pointed out that the new German government has proposed radical tax reform, which, if implemented, might really lead to a great stimulation not only of the German economy but the European economy. Is this example likely to be emulated by other European countries? And if so, is the European Union likely to emerge in the next decade as the next financial superpower?
I think that there is a change at the margin, not only in Germany but in the other European countries. Let's say Holland is ahead of Germany. I don't see the European Union emerging as any kind of a superpower, because it has structural problems that it has to resolve.
The last time the World Bank lent money to Russia, it ended up in private Swiss banks. How can we restructure the process to continue to increase global capitalism but prevent outright theft?
Well, as I say, the mechanism we found for helping Russia was just the wrong mechanism, because the IMF is in the business of signing a letter of intent with a government. And then if the government doesn't fulfill the terms of that letter, then it stops the support. But when you don't have a government, a functioning government, then this is not a feasible way to operate. We should have had a much more intrusive kind of intervention. We should have controlled the spending of the money that we provided. But we chose the IMF because we actually didn't want to put up any money. There was money in the IMF. It wasn't our money. We could tap into it. And that was, I think, a big mistake.
Switching continents, what role do you expect China to play in the world economy in the next 2 decades? And what impact, if any, can United States actions have on Chinese decisions?
I think I probably should pass on this because I'm not really, I had a foundation in China. I wound it up in 1989, and I haven't been to China since, and I really don't know the situation well enough.
Well, here's one you'll feel right at home with. It's about the hedge fund industry. Is it attracting assets from public and private pension funds at historic rates? Historically, hedge funds deteriorate when assets become large. Is this a problem?
Well, the hedge funds are, in fact, burgeoning. I mean, it's really probably the fastest growing sector of the financial markets. And of course, I am a fan of hedge funds. I think it's it establishes a greater identity of interest between the investor and the manager than for instance, mutual funds, where you're rewarded for the amount of money that you can attract and not for the amount of money that you can make. But there are pitfalls, and like any boom, it's going to have its correction.
Well, just to follow on that with another quick question, 2000 might well be remembered, one of our members says, as the great shakeout for the macro managers. What lessons can we learn?
Well, I think there's no doubt that the large hedge funds, they turned out to be dinosaurs. That includes my own. We became too large for the markets and really couldn't survive in the form that we reached. And we have, I think, learned that lesson, and we have broken ourselves up into smaller pieces, so we are no longer outsized for the market. There is a genuine question whether macro funds are viable. I've personally never thought that if a fund engaged only in what is called macro trading, which is basically investing in currencies or stock indexes or government bonds. In other words, these macro instruments. I never thought that they were viable, really, or very suitable as a freestanding business. I always had a macro overlay, but the basis of a hedge fund was always stock stock selection, both on the long and the short side. And I think that remains the right concept. And at times the macro overlay becomes very important, and at other times not.
Surprisingly, even some questions about the U.S. economy, John. Will a soft landing prevail? Where do you expect rates on the long bond to go in 2001? And where will the most attractive investments be in 2001? All easy questions to answer.
Well, I tell you, if I have the answers, but I'm not at liberty to disclose them.
It worked.
And one final question in our formal session. We have a number of students here, both from undergraduate colleges and business schools, and a newly graduated MBA student asked this question: what is your vision for how we integrate social responsibility with corporate profit-making goals?
Well, that is a very difficult question. I think that the business of business is to businesses are there to make money. That's their first responsibility, and the leeway that the managers of business have to be concerned about social considerations is greatly restricted by the intensification of competition. In a private business, you have a much more leeway than you do in a public corporation where you have responsibility to the shareholders. Then the shareholders have become much more demanding, and of course you've got professional managers that have also become more demanding. So I think to rely on business to fulfill social obligations is very risky. And that is why I think you really do need to have certain rules of the game that tell business what it can do and what it can't. This is very unfashionable to say that, because we have benefited greatly from the removal of restrictions. But I think the pendulum has swung too far in the United States. In countries like Russia and Ukraine, of course, and Hungary, I'm advocating the abolition of controls because it removes chances for corruption and so on. But in the United States, I think we have gone actually too far in removing controls.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure after hearing George Soros, you'll want to buy his latest book on the Open Society, which is on sale as you leave. And I'm sure you can all now better understand why George Soros is so highly acclaimed around the world, both as a financier and as a philanthropist. So thank you very much, George Soros, for this outstanding. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Mr. Soros's book, Open Society, Reforming Global Capitalism, is published by PublicAffairs and is available in bookstores. For more information on Open Society or PublicAffairs, visit their website at publicaffairsbooks.com. 48 hours of nonfiction books on TV. Your